So, in this essay, we're going to be basically looking back at George as a writer, which might seem insane since most of the content is focused on the visual media, and that's fine. I mean, it's called Thrones, so that's going to be a key aspect of what we look at. But I do actually try to go back and actually look at his actual written work beyond A Song of Ice and Fire. And as people know, he did have a career in Hollywood, which was relatively brief, but he was there. So let me catch people up and then we'll do the revelation here, which is pretty interesting. It's a little bit, but it gives us a fuller picture of who George is. So we know that George worked in Hollywood in various capacities as a screenplay writer and television writer. Specifically, he did work on The Twilight Zone and a show called Beauty and the Beast, which I watched growing up. I also watched some of the old Twilight Zone episodes, even some of his. It's not as good as the original, of course, but I thought it was pretty good for what it was in terms of trying to bring back Twilight Zone. So he's done that, and he's admitted to that stuff, but he's also had near calls where he almost worked on a certain television show. And which one it is actually pretty surprising, and it's actually pretty interesting in the reasoning why it didn't happen. So we're going to hear him speak with a fellow writer over what may have been a really interesting pairing between him and a very iconic and late 80s television series.
You see a lot of that stigma we talked about, that science fiction and fantasy, but science fiction in particular was subliterary, was not real literature. Still has its influences, I think, and you see people denying that they write science fiction when obviously they are writing science fiction. I mean, Margaret Atwood, her classical case here, where she denied, no, I'm not a science fiction writer. There are no squids from space in my stories. Yeah. And, she had to be informed that squids from space are not actually necessary, although they're fun. Yeah. And it crops up in the strangest places. I mean, during my television career at one point when Twilight Zone was winding down and Star Trek The Next Generation was just gearing up, I had an interview at Star Trek The Next Generation for a possible job as a staff writer. And I remember coming into the office of this producer, who thankfully did not last long on the show. And you can see where when I tell the story. And he said, well, I don't know who you are. Can you tell me your credentials? I said, well, I just coming off Twilight Zone, where I worked for a while. But before that, I wrote novels and short stories. I'm primarily a science fiction writer. And he said, oh, really? Well, Star Trek is not a science fiction show. It's a people show.
Oh, my God. A people show.
I was fooled by the photon torpedoes and the starship. I was misled. So needless to say, I didn't get that job after, making shameless fun of this idiot. The crazy denials that you get just mean, I don't want to be tarred with that brush, but the brush is outdated, and the modern audiences, like I think most of the people in this room, read all this with great enthusiasm and don't think of it even as a guilty pleasure or something subliterary, and hopefully that will go away in a few months.
All right, so we've heard George speak, and that's a quite interesting little tidbit. Now, whether ultimately he would have been hired on Trek, we'll never know, but obviously the way he answered the producer back with his, oh no, we're not doing science fiction here, we don't do that, probably ultimately would not work out between them, because George from the very beginning was a very big science fiction person. Although now he's primarily known as a, quote, fantasy writer, if you go back through most of his canon, actually it's probably more decidedly science fiction. But it's interesting in that conversation, he actually deferred a lot because he's sort of like, oof, I've been out of it. He hasn't done science fiction recently in quite a long time. It is mostly fantasy now. But again, there was a time he was basically a science fiction person. So you can understand why they wanted to bring him on board. But I guess they wanted to have the aura of someone who does science fiction, but not be only known for doing science fiction. And it's really weird because he's very clear that he credits Night Flyers, and selling it off as an adaptation is really helping him out when he was struggling as a writer. So it's pretty interesting. As a science fiction fan, he just had to stand up for the genre and said, oh, you mean you're not doing science fiction? I don't know, it seems weird. Phasers, spaceships, teleportation? Sure sounds like science fiction to me. So it's a very interesting revelation that he makes about how he was almost on Star Trek: The Next Generation. We don't know the producer. He doesn't name who it is, but I think we could infer it might be Rick Berman, because Rick Berman is kind of notorious among Trek fans that he's sort of been very good with Trek at certain points, but also very bad. And apparently, one on one, he doesn't like it. He doesn't like being associated with Trek. He kind of feels like it drags him down. He kind of feels dirty about it. He doesn't really feel proud that he's primarily known as a Trek producer. But he took the money. He's very grateful, of course, for being extremely rich. But he's kind of like, yeah, Trek, yeah. Everybody associates me with that. And if you are into Red Letter Media, they sort of make fun of him. In the course of their Star Wars videos, they call him out because Mike is a big Star Trek fan as well. So he feels kind of the equivalent that Rick Berman did what George Lucas did. He kind of destroyed the essence of Star Trek. But that's neither here nor there. But it's an interesting revelation and shows that he was really dedicated to doing science fiction writing for a while. But Hollywood being Hollywood, they just did not. They were not as receptive as they should have been, which makes you think, like, we might have gotten even a Star Trek movie out of him. So we'll never know. But an interesting added revelation in terms of where George is and who he is. I also wonder, like, is he ever going to allow kind of like these undone scripts to be published, kind of like either while he's living or when he's dead? Because it'll be very interesting to see where he was at, because he was working for a lot of big companies, and what exactly his mind was in terms of his projects, because there is a tie, which I'll do later in other videos, between the science fiction work and Game of Thrones. Of course, he's doing a lot of interesting allusions to his past work, but that's for another video. All right, this has been Game of Thrones Analyzed on what might have been in the Trekverse with George R.R. Martin. Thank you for listening. Please comment below, please hit the like, please share the content. Thanks again.